Sisters got $38 million. I got Dad's dusty briefcase. One phone number inside changed everything. The lawyer, a man named Carl, with a face like tired paper, didn't even look at me when he finished reading the will. He just pushed his glasses up his nose and started organizing his documents as if he had just read a grocery list. Across the polished mahogany table, my sisters, Ashley and Jessica, were trying very hard not to smile. They failed. Ashley covered her mouth with a perfectly manicured hand, a little squeak of delight escaping. Jessica just stared at me, her eyes cold and triumphant. They inherited $38 million. I got a dusty briefcase with one number. Ashley and Jessica underestimated my father's secret. Subscribe and like to see how I dismantled their empire. My sisters, Ashley and Jessica, had just inherited my father's entire fortune. They left me with his old beat-up briefcase, but they didn't know about the one secret he had hidden inside for me. This is the story of how I used that secret to dismantle their empire and take back what was mine, $38 million. The number echoed in my head. It was a stupid, impossible number. It was the value of the houses, the stocks, the art collection, the cars. It was the sum of a life's work. Our father, Robert, had built his company from nothing, and now it all belonged to them. Is that all? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Carl glanced up, annoyed. That is what the document states. To Ashley and Jessica, I leave my entire estate to be divided equally. To my son, I leave my briefcase. May it serve him as well as it served me. Jessica finally let out a small laugh. Well, that's touching. Dad always did love his old briefcase. She looked at Ashley, and they shared a look that twisted a knife in my gut. It was a look of shared victory, a private joke at my expense. For years they had told our father I was irresponsible, that I couldn't be trusted with money. They painted me as a failure, and it seemed that in the end, he had believed them. I'm sure it's full of important memories, Ashley added, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. I didn't say anything else. I just stood up, my legs feeling like they were made of stone. I walked over to the corner where the briefcase sat. It was dark brown leather, scuffed and worn at the edges. The brass latches were tarnished. It looked like something from another era. I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected. I walked out of that office without looking back. I could feel their eyes on me, their smug satisfaction filling the room. I walked through the city in a daze, the heavy briefcase banging against my leg. Each step was a reminder of my humiliation. By the time I got back to my tiny apartment, the anger had started to burn away the shock. I placed the briefcase on my small kitchen table and stared at it. For a moment, I thought about throwing it out the window. What good were memories when my sisters were planning how to spend millions? But something stopped me. My dad loved this briefcase. He took it everywhere. What if there was something more to it? With a sigh, I clicked open the old latches. The inside smelled like old paper and leather. It was filled with what looked like junk, old receipts, faded newspaper clippings, a couple of dried-up pens. My heart sank. So this was it. A box of trash. My inheritance. I started pulling things out, my frustration growing. I was about to dump the whole thing into the garbage when my fingers brushed against a small, hidden pocket in the lining. It was almost invisible. My breath caught in my throat. I carefully worked my fingers into the slit and pulled out a single, folded piece of paper. It wasn't a stock certificate or a deed. It was a small, yellowed note card. Written on it in my father's familiar handwriting was a name and a phone number. Just that. The name was Arthur. I stared at the number for a long time. Who was Arthur? The name wasn't familiar. He wasn't a family friend or a business partner I knew of. Why would my dad hide this? Why was this the one thing he left me tucked away like a secret? My mind was racing. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was just an old number for a repairman. But the way it was hidden, it felt important. My father was a deliberate man. He didn't do things by accident. Leaving me this briefcase with this hidden number was a message. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone. What could I even say? Hello, my dead father left me your number in a secret pocket? It sounded insane. But what did I have to lose? I had already lost everything else. I dialed the number. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, a man answered. His voice was deep and calm. Hello? I cleared my throat. Hello? I'm looking for someone named Arthur. There was a pause on the other end. It was a heavy silence, filled with unspoken questions. Who is calling? He asked, his tone suddenly cautious. My name, it doesn't matter, I started, then stopped myself. No, my father wanted him to know who I was. My father was Robert, I said, my voice stronger now. Robert left me this number. The silence that followed was even longer. I thought he had hung up. I was about to check my phone when the voice came back, low and serious. I see, Arthur said slowly. I've been waiting for this call for a very long time. That sentence hung in the air between us, heavy and strange. Waiting for this call? What did that mean? My mind was a mess of questions, but I forced myself to stay calm. Who are you? I asked, my voice steady. A friend of your father's, Arthur replied. A very old friend. It's not safe to talk on the phone. Can you meet? My heart was pounding. This was real. This wasn't some wrong number. This was something my father had planned. Yes. Where? He gave me the address of a small diner on the other side of town, a place I'd never heard of. Be there in 1 hour. Come alone, and bring the briefcase. He hung up before I could ask anything else. I stood there for a moment, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dead air. The briefcase. He knew about the briefcase. I looked at it sitting on my table. It wasn't just a container of junk anymore. It was a key. The hour passed in a blur. I didn't change my clothes. I just grabbed my keys, tucked the briefcase under my arm, and left. The diner was exactly as I pictured it. Old, quiet, with cracked vinyl booths and the smell of stale coffee in the air. There were only a few people inside. I saw him immediately. He was sitting in a booth in the far corner away from the windows. He was older, maybe in his late 60s, with gray hair and a face that looked like it had seen a lot. He wasn't big or imposing, but he had an intensity in his eyes that made you pay attention. He was watching the door. When he saw me, he gave a small, almost invisible nod. I walked over and slid into the booth opposite him. I placed the briefcase on the seat beside me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He just studied my face. "You have your father's eyes," he finally said. His voice was the same as on the phone, calm and deep. "But you have your mother's stubborn jaw." "You knew my mother?" I asked, surprised. "I knew them both for a very long time," and Arthur said. "Your father, Robert, was a good man, one of the best, but he was surrounded by sharks." He glanced at me. "I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry for what they did to you." "My sisters," I said, the name tasting like poison. Arthur nodded slowly. "Yes, Ashley and Jessica. Your father saw what they were becoming years ago. He saw their greed. He tried to guide them, but it was no use. They were only interested in the money, the power, and they were doing things inside the company that he couldn't stomach. This was new. I always thought my sisters were just spoiled and entitled. I never imagined them being involved in the business on a deeper level." "What things?" I asked. "Your father started his company with a simple principle. Build good things, treat people right, and be honest," Arthur explained, his gaze fixed on me. "In the last few years, as he got older, your sisters started taking more control. They brought in new partners, made deals he didn't approve of. They started cutting corners, moving money around in ways that weren't clean. Your father found out. He confronted them. I could picture it. My father, a man of principle, facing his two daughters. What happened? A sad look crossed Arthur's face. They turned it on him. They told him he was old, that he was losing his mind, that he didn't understand modern business. They used his love for them against him. They isolated him, and they started a plan to push him out of his own company. The will, that was their final move. They convinced him you were a reckless fool who would squander any money, while they were the responsible ones who would protect his legacy. The story hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just that they had taken my inheritance. They had systematically destroyed my relationship with my own father. They had poisoned his mind against me. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. "Because your father knew this day would come," Arthur said. He reached across the table and tapped the briefcase. He couldn't fight them openly. His health was failing, and they had too much control, so he prepared. "He left you that briefcase for a reason. It's not full of memories, son. It's an arsenal." My breath caught in my throat. "An arsenal?" I thought about the old receipts and pens. "It's just junk, old papers." Arthur smiled for the first time. It was a thin, knowing smile. "Is it? Look again." Robert was a clever man. He knew they would go through his things. He had to hide the important stuff in plain sight. He leaned in. "The bottom lining. Feel it." I pulled the briefcase onto my lap and ran my fingers along the inside bottom. There it was, a slight ridge, a seam that shouldn't be there. I worked my nail under it and pulled. A false bottom lifted away, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment. When Arthur showed me how to open the hidden compartment, I thought I had found the proof I needed, a small black ledger. But most of the pages were written in a code I didn't understand, a series of numbers and letters next to dates. It was a record of transactions, of secret payments, but I still didn't know who the payments were going to or what Project Nightfall meant. That phrase was written at the top of several pages. Arthur saw the confusion on my face. "That's your starting point," he said. "Your father couldn't decipher all of it before he died. He knew they were hiding money, funneling it into a secret project. That ledger is the key. If you can figure out that code, you'll find out where the money went, and you'll have everything you need to take them down." I looked from the coded ledger to Arthur's serious face. This was bigger than I ever imagined. My father hadn't abandoned me. He had armed me. He had given me a mission. My anger and grief began to morph into something else, something cold and hard. Determination. "I don't know how to break a code," I said. "No," Arthur agreed, "but I do." For the next few days, that diner booth became our office. We met every morning. Arthur would arrive first, a thermos of black coffee and a stack of notebooks already on the table. He taught me to see what my father had seen. The code wasn't complex, he said. It was personal. Robert wasn't a spy. He was an old-fashioned businessman who trusted his own mind more than computers. "Your father used a system based on dates that were important to him," Arthur explained, tapping a line of numbers with his pen. "Your birthday, your mother's, the day he founded the company. He would add or subtract those numbers from the real figures. It's a simple key, but impossible to guess unless you knew him. It was slow, painful work. Each decoded line felt like a small victory, but also a fresh wound. I was learning about my father's secret world through a series of cold numbers, while also being reminded of all the family moments he had cherished. Moments Ashley and Jessica had twisted and used against him. We filled pages with calculations. We drank gallons of coffee. We slowly, painstakingly began to translate the ledger. Most of it was what we expected. Records of money being moved out of the main company accounts into a separate entity, a shell corporation called Zenith Holdings. The amounts were staggering. Millions of dollars siphoned off over 3 years. "This is classic fraud," Arthur said, his voice grim as he looked over our work. "They were bleeding the company dry, building their own secret nest egg. If the board knew about this, they'd be finished." But the ledger held more than just numbers. Next to some of the largest transactions, my father had made notes, not names, but initials. AH and JP, my sisters, Ashley and Jessica, and next to their initials another name appeared over and over again. Walter. "Who is Walter?" I asked, pointing to the name. Arthur leaned back, rubbing his tired eyes. "If I had to guess, he's their money man. The accountant who makes all this disappear. The one who knows where all the bodies are buried, financially speaking." He looked at me, his expression serious. "This Walter is our next step. The numbers in this book are proof, but they're just numbers. Walter is the human element. He can testify. He can tell us what Project Nightfall is." The name sent a chill down my spine. It sounded like something out of a movie, not a business plan. "So we find him. We go to the police with this?" Arthur shook his head. "Not yet. We don't know how deep this goes. Your sisters are smart, and they're greedy. People like that have connections. They'll have lawyers who can tie this up in court for years, claim the ledger as a forgery, and paint you as a disgruntled son. No, we need more. We need Walter to talk to us first." He explained the danger. If Ashley and Jessica found out we were digging, they wouldn't hesitate to silence Walter or us. They had too much to lose. This wasn't just about inheritance anymore. This was about serious crimes. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Arthur asked, his eyes searching mine. "There's no turning back from here. They will not play fair." I thought of their smug faces in the lawyer's office. I thought of them laughing at my inheritance, the worn-out briefcase. I thought of how they had poisoned my father's last years. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," I said, my voice low and hard. It took Arthur 2 days to find him. Walter was a senior partner at a small, discreet accounting firm downtown. He lived a quiet life in the suburbs, drove a sensible car, and seemed, on the surface, completely ordinary. He was the perfect person to handle dirty money. No one would ever suspect him. We watched him for a day. We learned his routine. Coffee at the same shop at 7:30 a.m. at his desk by 8 a.m. Lunch at his desk. Left the office at 6 p.m. on the dot. He was a creature of habit. Predictable. That was his weakness. "We'll approach him away from his office and his home," Arthur planned. "Somewhere neutral. Somewhere he'll feel trapped." The plan was simple. I would wait for him near the parking garage after he left work. Arthur would be nearby, watching. I wouldn't threaten him. I would just show him something that would prove I knew his secret. That evening, my heart hammered against my ribs as I stood in the shadows of the concrete garage. The air was cool and smelled of gasoline. Each passing car made me jump. I clutched a single piece of paper in my hand, a photocopy of one page from the ledger, the page that showed a $2 million transfer to Zenith Holdings, with Walter's name written clearly beside it in my father's hand. I thought I had a clear path. I thought finding Walter would give us all the answers we needed, but as I saw his familiar figure walking towards me, I still didn't understand the true nature of what my sisters had built, or the darkness hidden behind the name Project Nightfall. The sound of his footsteps echoed on the concrete, getting closer. Walter was a man who looked like he was made of beige. Beige suit, beige hair, a beige forgettable face. He was the perfect ghost for moving money. He walked with his head down, keys already in his hand, a man on autopilot, eager to get back to his quiet beige life. I stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. "Walter!" He jumped, a small, startled squeak escaping his lips. His eyes darted around, wide with fear. He clutched his briefcase to his chest like a shield. "Who are you? What do you want?" "My name doesn't matter," I said, keeping my voice low and even. I didn't want to scare him into running. Not yet. "I want to talk about Zenith Holdings and about Project Nightfall." The color drained from his face. He went from beige to a sickly white. He knew. Of course he knew. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, taking a half step back. "I think you do," I said, and I held out the photocopy. It was just one page from the ledger, but it was enough. His name was right there, next to a 7-figure transfer. My father's neat, precise handwriting felt like a judgment from beyond the grave. I thought I had him. I thought that piece of paper paper was the key that would unlock everything. I expected him to break down, to beg, to confess, but when Walter looked at the paper, his face did something I didn't expect. The fear was there, yes, but underneath it was something else, a deep, weary sadness. His shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in resignation. He looked up at me and his eyes were filled with a strange, unnerving pity. "You have no idea," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You think this is about money." That one sentence hit me harder than any threat. A cold feeling spread through my chest. What else could it be about? Ashley and Jessica had always been driven by money. Their entire lives were a monument to greed. "What do you mean?" I asked, my own confidence wavering. "The money is just the fuel, not the engine," Walter said, his gaze distant as if he were looking at something horrible only he could see. "Project Nightfall. It's not a bank account in the Cayman Islands. It's a weapon." "A weapon?" The word hung in the cold air of the garage. What kind of weapon could you build with stolen company funds? It made no sense. My sisters were socialites and ruthless businesswomen, not arms dealers. "You're not making any sense," I said, trying to regain control of the conversation. Walter let out a shaky, bitter laugh. "Of course I'm not. You're Robert's son. You see the world in black and white just like he did. Honorable and dishonorable. Legal and illegal." He shook his head slowly. "Your sisters, they operate in the gray, and their weapon isn't made of steel. It's made of information." He took a deep breath, his eyes darting towards the garage exit as if expecting them to appear at any moment. "They've been using that money for years to build a private intelligence network. They buy data. They hire people to dig up dirt. Politicians, judges, business rivals. Anyone who could ever be a threat to them or an asset. Project Nightfall is their collection. A library of secrets, leverage, enough to ruin hundreds of lives, to control people, to make them do whatever Ashley and Jessica want." I stood there, frozen. This was so much worse than fraud. Stealing money was a crime. What he was describing was a quiet, insidious form of power that was almost untouchable. They weren't just building a fortune, they were building an empire of blackmail. "Why?" I finally managed to ask. "Why would they do this?" Walter looked at me again, that pity back in his eyes. "Because your father built a company. They want to build a kingdom, and in their world, you don't rule with a crown. You rule with fear. You rule by knowing everyone's darkest secret." He pushed the paper back towards me. "I can't help you," he said, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "They know things about me, about my family, things that I can't risk it. If they know you've talked to me, I'm a dead man, and you are too." He turned and practically ran towards his car, fumbling with his keys. He didn't look back. I stood there for a long time, the photocopy feeling flimsy and useless in my hand. Arthur appeared silently beside me, his face grim. He had heard everything. "A weapon made of information," Arthur said, his voice low. "Your father suspected something like this, but he never had proof. He thought they were just covering their tracks." We walked out of the garage and into the fading light of the evening. The city lights were starting to come on, but everything felt darker now. My mission had changed. I wasn't just trying to reclaim my inheritance and expose a financial crime. I was trying to disarm a bomb that I never knew existed, and I had no idea how many lives were already in its blast radius. My sisters weren't just thieves, they were monsters, and I was the only one who knew. The walk back to Arthur's office was quiet. The sounds of the city, which usually felt alive and full of energy, now seemed menacing. Every passing car could be one of them. Every person on the street could be an informant. The world Walter had described was a world of shadows, and I felt like I had just been dragged into it. We sat in his small, cluttered office, the only light coming from a green desk lamp. The rest of the room was dark. It felt appropriate. "So what do we do?" I asked, the words feeling heavy and useless. "We can't go to the police. We can't trust anyone. They have a library of secrets, Arthur. They could have something on the police commissioner for all we know." Arthur didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his creaky chair, steepling his fingers under his chin. He looked old, older than I had ever seen him. The weight of this knowledge seemed to be aging him in real time. "A direct attack is suicide," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "If we make a move and they find out, they won't just destroy us. They'll destroy everyone we've ever spoken to. Walter is right to be afraid. They use people's lives as shields." I slammed my fist on his desk, making a stack of papers jump. "So we do nothing? We just let them build this empire of fear?" "No," Arthur said calmly, his eyes steady on mine. "We don't fight them in their world. We can't win there. They have more money, more connections, more information. We have to find a different battlefield." He leaned forward. "We have to go back to the beginning. Your father, he knew something was wrong. He must have left more than just my phone number." The briefcase. It was sitting on the floor by my chair, looking pathetic and old. I'd almost forgotten about it. "It's just a bunch of old papers," I said, feeling hopeless. "Contracts from the 80s, old photos, a pen that doesn't work." "Look again," Arthur insisted. "Your father was a meticulous man. He wasn't sentimental. If he kept something, there was a reason. Every single item. Look at it not as his son, but as a detective looking for a clue he doesn't know exists. He had a point. Defeated, I pulled the briefcase onto my lap and clicked open the worn brass latches. The familiar smell of old leather and paper filled the small space between us. I took everything out one by one and laid it on the desk under the lamplight. There were the bundled contracts tied with string, a photo of my mother and father when they were young, a silver tie clip with his initials, R.A., a heavy fountain pen, a few old company brochures, junk, memories, nothing more. I told you, I said, slumping back. It's nothing. Arthur didn't say anything. He just picked up the empty briefcase. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. He ran his fingers along the inside, along the worn fabric lining. He pressed on the bottom. Nothing. He tapped the sides. Then he stopped. He tapped again, a thoughtful look on his face. There's a saying, he said softly. The best place to hide a book is in a library. He took a small letter opener from his desk and carefully, patiently, began to pry at the edge of the fabric lining at the bottom of the case. It was glued down tight, but after a moment, a corner lifted, and underneath it there was another bottom, a false one. My heart started to pound. Arthur worked the letter opener around the edges until he could lift the thin piece of wood. Underneath, nestled in a perfectly cut recess, was a small, black, leather-bound book. It was no bigger than my hand. It had no title. I reached for it, my fingers trembling slightly. It felt cool and solid. I opened it. The pages were filled with my father's neat, precise handwriting. It wasn't a diary. It was a ledger. On each page was a name or a company name. Next to it were dates, strings of numbers, and short cryptic notes. Panther Holdings, Asset Transfer, Shell Corp 1, Judge Miller, Campaign Donation, Hidden Source, Aurora Logistics, Port Clearance, Irregular Payment. It was a list of transactions, a list of favors, a list of secrets. It wasn't Project Nightfall, but it was the seed from which it grew. My father had been tracking them. He had been building a case piece by piece in the only way he knew how, quietly, secretly, on paper, in a place he knew they would never look. They saw the briefcase as a symbol of his past, an insult to me. They never would have imagined it was his weapon, waiting for the right person to find it. He knew, I whispered, tracing a line of his handwriting with my finger. He knew they were corrupt. He just didn't know how deep it went. And now we have his roadmap, Arthur said, a new energy in his voice. This isn't a library of blackmail. This is a trail of breadcrumbs, a trail of their financial crimes. This is something we can use. This is something the law can understand. I looked at the book, then at Arthur. The despair I'd been feeling for the past hour began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. My sisters had their weapon of information, but my father had just handed me mine. It was a weapon made of truth, and I was going to learn how to use it. The next few weeks were a blur of caffeine and paper. Arthur and I turned his small, quiet office into a war room. We bought a huge whiteboard and started mapping out the connections from the little black book. Each name was a star, and we drew lines between them, trying to create a constellation of their crimes. It was slow, frustrating work. The notes my father left were clues, not confessions. Aurora Logistics. Irregular payment didn't mean anything without knowing what the payment was for, where it came from, and where it went. We were looking at a mountain of secrets with no tools to climb it. We're missing a piece, Arthur said one night, staring at the board. His eyes were tired. We have the who and the what. We don't have the how. We can't see the money moving. It's like trying to describe a river by only looking at the fish. He was right. My sisters were smart. They wouldn't leave a simple trail. Their money would flow through dozens of shell companies across different countries, changing names and forms until it was clean. We needed someone who could follow that river, no matter how much it twisted and turned. We needed a specialist. I know a man, Arthur said a few days later. His name is Vincent. He used to work for the government, tracking money for the IRS. Now he does private work. He's expensive, but he's the best. He can find a single dollar hidden in a hurricane. We met Vincent in a small, nondescript office in a part of town that was all gray concrete and glass. He was a small man with sharp eyes and a quiet way of moving. He looked more like a librarian than a financial hunter. He listened patiently as Arthur explained the situation, his face showing no emotion. Then I placed my father's black book on the table between us. Vincent picked it up. He didn't open it right away. He just held it, feeling its weight. Then he opened it to a random page. His eyes scanned the lines of my father's handwriting. He flipped a few more pages, then a few more. He closed the book and placed it back on the table. Your father was a very careful man, Vincent said. His voice was soft, but it carried weight. This isn't just a list. It's a foundation. He didn't have the tools to build the house, but he laid the groundwork perfectly. He looked at me. Most people who do what your sisters did are arrogant. They think they're smarter than everyone else. They leave tracks. Small ones, but they're there. This book, he tapped its cover, tells me where to start looking for those tracks. My sisters inherited millions while I got a briefcase and a number. What would you do in my place? Comment your thoughts and share this betrayal. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a real surge of hope. It wasn't just me and Arthur against the world anymore. We had a guide. The next 2 months were the most intense of my life. Vincent worked with a quiet, relentless focus. We gave him access to a separate bank account Arthur had set up, and he used the funds to legally access databases, public records, and international financial registries. months. He was a ghost in the machine, following the digital breadcrumbs my sisters had left behind. Every few days, he would send us a report. It was like watching a photograph develop in a darkroom. Slowly, shapes began to appear from the darkness. A shell company in the Cayman Islands linked to Ashley. A real estate purchase in Europe made through a proxy owned by Jessica. A series of payments to a certain Judge Miller funneled through 3 different charities. My father's notes were the key. Vincent was the one who could turn the key in the lock. Piece by piece, he was building the house my father had designed. A house of cards for my sisters, ready to collapse. One evening, Arthur called me into his office. Vincent was there standing in front of the whiteboard. It was no longer a mess of questions. It was a detailed map. A map of my sister's criminal empire. He had printed out bank statements, transfer records, and incorporation documents. He had highlighted names and numbers in yellow and red. "We have it," Vincent said simply. "We have the complete unbroken chain of money from your father's company to their personal offshore accounts. It's tax evasion, fraud, and bribery. It's more than enough." Finally, I had the proof. I had the weapons. Ashley and Jessica had no idea what was coming. They were probably at some fancy party, drinking champagne and laughing, thinking they had won. They couldn't have been more wrong. In a matter of weeks, their world would be ashes. I would make sure of it. But first, I needed to see them one last time. I needed to look them in the eye, knowing what I knew, and watch them lie. I chose the most expensive restaurant in the city, a place my sisters loved, a place where they felt at home, surrounded by polished wood and quiet money. I made the reservation under my father's name, Robert, a small, cruel touch that I knew they would both appreciate and despise. I called Ashley first. She answered with an annoyed sigh. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice clipped. "I want to have dinner," I said calmly. "You, me, and Jessica. Let's talk. I'm tired of fighting." There was a pause. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, the suspicion warring with her own arrogance. Her ego won. "Fine," she said. "Where?" I told her the name of the restaurant. I heard a faint sound of surprise. "I'll let Jessica know," she said, and hung up. I arrived early and took a table in a quiet corner. I watched the other patrons. They all had the same look of easy confidence, the look of people who had never known a day of real struggle. This was my sister's world, a world built on lies. They arrived 20 minutes late, of course. They made an entrance. Ashley in a bright red dress that screamed for attention, Jessica in a severe black suit that looked more expensive than my car. They walked to the table as if they owned the place. They probably knew half the people in the room. "Well, well," Ashley said, sitting down without looking at me. She placed her designer purse on the empty chair beside her. "Look what the cat dragged in." Jessica sat opposite me, her face a cold mask. "This is a waste of time. What is this about?" "I told you," I said, keeping my voice even. "I want to make peace." Ashley laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. "Peace? You mean you've run out of money and you're here to beg? How predictable." "I don't want your money," I said, and for the first time, I realized I was telling the complete truth. It wasn't about the $38 million anymore. It was about justice. It was about my father. A waiter appeared, and they ordered the most expensive wine on the list without consulting me. They talked to each other, ignoring me, discussing some charity gala they were chairing. They were performing, showing me how high they had climbed, how far beneath them I was. I let them. I watched them, studying their faces, their gestures, the way Ashley constantly checked her reflection in her spoon, the way Jessica's eyes darted around the room, assessing everyone. "So," Jessica finally said, turning her cold gaze on me, "you're tired of fighting. What's your offer?" "It's not an offer," I said. "It's just a question." I was going through some of Dad's old things. I found notes about his business. It was confusing. Ashley rolled her eyes. "Daddy's business was very complicated. Far too complicated for you to understand." "Probably," I agreed. "For instance, I saw some notes about his accounts in the Cayman Islands. I never knew he had business there." A flicker. It was tiny, almost invisible, but I saw it. In Jessica's eyes, a momentary tightening. Ashley just scoffed. "You're imagining things," Ashley said. "Dad never did business there. It was all domestic. He was a very careful man," Jessica added, her voice smooth as glass. "He kept everything above board." They were lying, directly to my face without a hint of shame. They were so confident in their story, so certain of my ignorance. That was the confirmation I needed. I needed to see it for myself. I leaned back in my chair. "You're right. Must have been my mistake. Just old dusty papers. Probably meant nothing." We finished the dinner in near silence. They ate their expensive food and drank their expensive wine. I barely touched my plate. My appetite was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. When the bill came, I placed my credit card on the small tray. It was the card Arthur had given me, linked to the war chest he'd set up. Ashley laughed out loud. "Are you sure that will work? Don't embarrass us." "It'll work," I said. I stood up. "Thank you for the dinner. It was illuminating." Jessica looked at me, a slight frown on her face. "Is that all? You dragged us all the way out here for nothing?" "Not for nothing," I said, looking looking them both in the eye one last time. I just wanted to say goodbye. I turned and walked away, leaving them at the table. I didn't look back. I could feel their confused, angry stares on my back. Let them wonder. They would have their answers soon enough. As I walked out into the cool night air, I felt a sense of peace. The final piece was in place. I had seen the rot up close. I had heard the lies from their own mouths. There was no doubt left, no shred of family sentiment to hold me back. Vincent had given me the map and the ammunition. Now it was time to start the war. They thought this was the end of the conversation. They had no idea it was the beginning of their end. The war didn't start with a bang. It started with a click. I sat in a small, anonymous apartment that Arthur had rented for me. It smelled of fresh paint and new carpets. It was a sterile, empty box, a perfect place to dismantle a life. On the table in front of me was a laptop, also new, and a stack of files Vincent had delivered. His work was terrifyingly thorough. It was a complete anatomy of my sister's financial lives built on the foundation of my father's secrets. Vincent had found everything: the shell corporations, the hidden transfers, the inflated invoices. He had traced the money from my father's company through a maze of accounts and into personal slush funds used by Ashley and Jessica. They weren't just enjoying their inheritance. They were actively siphoning money from the company my father built, treating it like a personal piggy bank. They bought jewelry, cars, and funded lavish parties, all while listing the expenses as corporate consulting or marketing development. My hands were steady as I opened an encrypted email service. Arthur had walked me through the process. Use a public Wi-Fi, a burner laptop, a secure connection. Leave no trace. My target wasn't a person. It was an institution, the Internal Revenue Service. I drafted a simple, clear message. It was an anonymous tip from a concerned employee. I didn't use emotional language. I just stated facts and attached the first set of documents: bank statements from the Cayman Islands, transfer records with Jessica's signature, false invoices approved by Ashley. I attached just enough to make them look. Once they started looking, Vincent assured me they wouldn't be able to stop. I read the message one last time. Subject: massive tax fraud at Roberts Holdings Inc. The body was short, pointing them to the attachments. I hovered the cursor over the send button. For a moment, I saw my father's face. Would he have wanted this? His life's work turned into a battlefield. Then I remembered Jessica's triumphant smile and Ashley's mocking laughter. They had turned his legacy into a monument to their own greed. They left me with nothing but a dusty briefcase, confident I was too stupid and too weak to do anything about it. I clicked send. The email vanished into the digital ether. The first domino had been pushed. It would take weeks, maybe months, for it to hit the next one, but the chain reaction had begun. That was the slow war, the war of accountants and auditors. But I needed a faster one too, the war of public opinion. Vincent had given me another file, this one much thinner. It wasn't about money, it was about people. He had found a dozen former employees of my father's company who had been fired by my sisters in the first month after they took over. Loyal people, some of whom had worked with my father for decades. They were dismissed without cause, replaced by young, slick people from Jessica's social circle. They were given tiny severance packages and forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. Vincent had found one who was willing to talk, a woman named Laura. She had been my father's executive assistant for 30 years. Ashley had fired her personally, telling her she was old furniture that needed to be replaced. Laura was heartbroken and angry. The non-disclosure agreement was legally shaky, and Arthur was confident he could break it. I didn't contact Laura directly. Instead, I sent her file to a journalist, a hungry, aggressive reporter Vincent had recommended, known for taking down powerful people. The file was sent from another burner email, another anonymous tip. This time, the subject was brutal corporate practices and heartless heiresses. I laid out the story, gave him Laura's contact information, and attached proof of her long service and the insulting severance check. I painted a picture of two cruel, out-of-touch socialites destroying a beloved family company. Then, I waited. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. The silence was heavy. I started to wonder if it had been a mistake. Maybe their power and money had smothered the sparks before they could catch fire. I stayed in the small apartment, watching the news, scanning the financial pages, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. Arthur called to check in. Patience, he said. These things take time. Empires don't fall in a day. He was right. On the 15th day, the first story broke. It was a small article on a financial news website, buried in the business section. IRS launches inquiry into Roberts Holdings Inc. following anonymous tip. It didn't have many details, but it was there. The stock, which was publicly traded, dipped 5%. Ashley and Jessica released a statement calling it a baseless rumor started by a disgruntled former employee. They were arrogant, dismissive. They thought they could crush it. They were wrong. The next day, the big big story hit. The journalist I contacted had done his job. It was the front page of the city's biggest newspaper's lifestyle section. The headline was huge. Daddy's girls are corporate monsters. Heiresses accused of cruelty and greed. The article featured a big, sympathetic photo of Laura, looking sad and dignified. She told her story beautifully, painting a picture of my father as a kind, loyal boss and my sisters as cold-hearted tyrants. The story went viral. I sat in my empty apartment, reading the article on my phone. I saw the comments flooding in online. People were furious. The story of the loyal, discarded employee versus the cruel rich sisters was perfect fuel for public outrage. My phone buzzed. It was Arthur. "It's starting," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of excitement. "I just got a call from a friend at my old firm. Jessica called him in a panic. They have no idea where this is coming from. They're blaming everyone. They're turning on each other." I smiled. It was the first real smile I'd had in months. They were blind, trapped in their glass castle. They couldn't imagine the attack was coming from the person they'd thrown out into the dirt. They thought this was a storm. They had no idea it was a war, and I was just getting started. The first crack was a hairline fracture. The story about Laura was just the beginning of the earthquake. The internet did what it does best. It took a story of injustice and turned it into a wildfire. Memes appeared overnight. Ashley and Jessica were painted as cartoon villains, modern-day Marie Antoinettes. Their social media accounts, once filled with pictures of yachts and parties, were flooded with angry comments. People started using a hashtag, "Now cancel the heirs." I watched it all unfold from my tiny apartment. It was like watching a nature documentary. Two predators, so used to being at the top of the food chain, suddenly finding themselves surrounded by a much larger, angrier herd. They tried to fight back, of course. Their first move was a disaster. They hired a high-priced public relations firm that advised them to release a video statement. They sat side by side on a white sofa in one of their mansions, looking stiff and uncomfortable. Ashley spoke first, reading from a screen. Her voice was flat. "We are deeply saddened by the baseless accusations made against us." Then Jessica took over, and her arrogance broke through the carefully crafted script. "We've always valued our employees," she said, with a little sneer I knew so well. "But in a modern business, sometimes you have to make tough decisions to stay competitive. Not everyone understands that. It was a fatal mistake." She sounded condescending, dismissive. The comment section exploded. "Tough decisions? You mean firing a woman who worked for your father for 30 years? One person wrote. Another said, "They're not even sorry." The video's dislike-to-like ratio was astronomical. They had thrown gasoline on the fire. My phone rang. It was Arthur. "Did you see it?" he asked, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I did," I said. "It's worse than I could have hoped for." "They're amateurs," he said. "They're used to money solving every problem. They don't know how to handle a crisis of public opinion. But this is just the opening act. Are you ready for the next part?" "I am," I said, feeling a cold resolve. The next morning, the second story broke. This one wasn't in the lifestyle section. It was on the front page of the financial news. The headline was simple and brutal. "Roberts Holdings Inc.'s under formal investigation by IRS for tax irregularities." The small inquiry Arthur had triggered was now a full-blown audit. The article mentioned that the investigation seemed to focus on the period immediately after my father's death. It was a direct hit. The stock, which had stabilized after the first drop, plummeted. It lost 20% of its value in a single morning. Investors started to panic. Business partners who had deals with the company started making nervous phone calls. The empire wasn't just being criticized, it was starting to bleed money. That afternoon, Vincent sent me a new email. It had a single attachment, a set of credit card statements, company credit cards, in the names of Ashley and Jessica. He had gotten them from a disgruntled accountant in the finance department, another person my sisters had alienated. The statements were a goldmine, hundreds of thousands of dollars in personal expenses charged to the company. Designer clothes, spa weekends, jewelry, even a down payment on Jessica's new sports car. It was all there, itemized and dated. They weren't just cruel, they were sloppy, arrogant thieves. They were using the company like their personal piggy bank. "This is the proof," Arthur said when I forwarded him the file. "This isn't just bad PR, this is fraud. Wire fraud, tax evasion. This is jail time." The words hung in the air. Jail time. Suddenly the stakes felt much higher. This was no longer about public shame or financial loss. This was about putting them in a cage. I thought about my father's briefcase, that dusty, forgotten object. It had contained a single phone number, a key to a world I never knew existed. A world of lawyers like Arthur and investigators like Vincent, a world where justice could be bought and revenge could be meticulously planned. My sisters had $38 million. They had power and connections, but they were walking into a trap they couldn't see. They were fighting ghosts. They blamed disgruntled employees in the media. They never once suspected me, the brother they had discarded, the one they left with nothing. I saved the credit card statements to a new flash drive. I put them in an envelope along with a short, anonymous note explaining what they were. This time, the package wasn't for a journalist. It was for the lead agent at the IRS, the one whose name was mentioned in the financial article. I walked to a post office in a different part of the city and mailed it. As the envelope disappeared into the slot, I felt no joy, just a quiet, heavy certainty. The machine was in motion, and it was designed to crush everything in its path. I was no longer just taking back what was mine. I was going to burn their world to the ground. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet. I expected an explosion, a sudden eruption of chaos. Instead, there was a tense silence, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm breaks. I spent the time watching the company's stock ticker online. It was a flat line, a patient on life support, neither recovering nor dying. It was waiting. Then on a Thursday afternoon, Arthur called. His voice was different. It wasn't excited anymore. It was low, serious. "It's done," he said. "They took the bait." "What happened?" I asked, my heart starting to beat a little faster. "The IRS isn't just auditing them anymore," Arthur explained. "The evidence you sent was so clear, so undeniable, that they've opened a criminal investigation. This is beyond taxes now. This is the FBI. The FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The words felt heavy, like stones. I had thrown a rock, and I had started an avalanche. "They executed a search warrant this morning," Arthur continued. "Agents walked into the corporate headquarters. They took computers, boxes of files, servers, everything. It was quiet, professional, and absolutely devastating for them. I pictured it, the sleek, modern office my father had built. Ashley and Jessica in their expensive suits, their faces a mask of shock as men and women in dark windbreakers calmly dismantled their kingdom piece by piece. "They don't know who sent the files?" I asked. "Anonymous tip," Arthur said. "They're probably blaming every employee they've ever wronged," which, from what Vincent tells me, is a very long list. That evening, the news finally broke. It wasn't a lifestyle piece anymore. It was the lead story on every major financial news channel. Robert's holdings raided by FBI and fraud investigation. They showed helicopter footage of the office building, with small figures moving in and out. They showed file photos of my sisters, smiling at some party, looking confident and untouchable. Now they looked like fools. The next morning, the stock didn't just fall. It ceased to exist. Trading was halted. The company was effectively frozen, its assets under federal scrutiny. The empire my father built was paralyzed. I received an email from Vincent. It was a forward of a company-wide memo sent by Ashley. It was a masterpiece of panic and delusion. She called the investigation a hostile attack by jealous competitors. She threatened legal action against anyone spreading malicious rumors. She promised all employees that the company was strong and that this was just a temporary misunderstanding. She ended it by announcing a mandatory all-hands meeting the next day. "She's losing it," Vincent wrote in his own note above the forward. "She's trying to bully the FBI. People are terrified. Everyone is updating their resumes." My sister's reaction was exactly what I had hoped for. They were arrogant. They believed their money and their name made them immune to consequences. They couldn't imagine a world where they could be held accountable. Instead of hiring crisis managers and cooperating, they were lashing out, making themselves look more guilty with every word. They fired the chief financial officer, the man who had been with my father for 20 years. They made him the scapegoat, leaking to the press that he was the one responsible for the accounting errors. It was a clumsy, desperate move. The man, a respected figure in the industry, immediately hired a lawyer and announced he would cooperate fully with the investigation to clear his name. My sisters had just created another powerful enemy. "They're cornered animals," Arthur said on our next call, "and they're biting everyone around them. The CFO's testimony will be devastating. He knows where all the bodies are buried." I felt a strange detachment from it all. I was watching a building collapse in slow motion, a building I had rigged with explosives. I knew every crack that would appear, every floor that would give way. There was no satisfaction, just a cold sense of inevitability. "They have a charity gala this weekend," Arthur said, his voice shifting. "The annual Children's Hospital benefit. It's their big social event of the year. Jessica is the chairwoman of the board." "They're still going?" I asked, surprised. "Of course they are," he replied. "To cancel would be to admit defeat. They have to show up and pretend everything is fine. They have to smile for the cameras and act like they're still in control. It's their last stand." An idea started to form in my mind, a final public act of humiliation. It was more cruel than anything I had done so far. It wasn't just about taking their money or their company. It was about destroying their identity. "What are you thinking?" Arthur asked, sensing my silence. "They love the spotlight," I said slowly. "They love being seen as philanthropists, as society leaders. It's the one thing they have left, and you want to take that away too," he finished. "I want the whole world to see them for what they are," I said. "Not just investors and agents. I want everyone to see the truth." I looked at the dusty briefcase sitting in the corner of my small apartment. It had given me a key, and with that key, I had unlocked a door to a darkness I never knew I had inside me. The plan was taking shape. The gala would not be their last stand. It would be their public execution. The plan was simple and brutal. Arthur Arthur arranged for a small donation to the hospital, just enough to get 2 tickets to the gala. They wouldn't be for me. They would be for Laura, the journalist, and her cameraman. They would have front row seats to the collapse. Vincent, who had access to the event's technical systems as part of the company's sponsorship, would handle the main event. He would switch the video feed at the precise moment Jessica was giving her keynote address. Instead of a touching video about the hospital's work, the screens would display the most damning pages from my father's ledger, the secret accounts, the offshore transfers, the notes in his own handwriting detailing the fraud. And for the final touch, Vincent had managed to get an audio recording from a board meeting last week. It was Ashley speaking to their lawyers saying, "The FBI can look all they want. They'll never find it. We're smarter than Dad ever was." I wouldn't be there. Arthur insisted it was too risky. Instead, I watched from my apartment on a live news feed that Laura had set up for me. It felt distant, like watching a movie. The night of the gala arrived. The news feed showed a river of expensive cars pulling up to a grand hotel. Men in tuxedos and women in glittering gowns walked a red carpet. It was a spectacle of wealth and influence, and there they were. Ashley and Jessica stepped out of a Blacktown car, smiling for the cameras. They looked perfect. Jessica wore a deep blue dress that shimmered under the lights. Ashley was in a sharp, white suit, looking like the powerful executive she pretended to be. They radiated confidence. They were untouchable. Inside, the ballroom was a fantasy of crystal and gold. Laura's camera panned across the room, showing hundreds of the city's most powerful people sipping champagne and laughing. My sisters moved through the crowd like royalty, accepting compliments, shaking hands, completely unaware of the guillotine hanging over their heads. I sat in my dark apartment, the only light coming from the laptop screen. My heart was pounding. This was it, the final move. An hour into the event, the master of ceremonies took the stage. He spoke in a smooth, practiced voice about generosity and community. Then he introduced the chairwoman of the board, my sister. "Please give a warm welcome to Jessica," he boomed. The room erupted in applause. Jessica walked to the podium, beaming. She looked directly into the main camera, as if she was looking right at me. She placed her notes on the lectern and waited for the applause to die down. "Thank you," she began, her voice filled with fake warmth. "It is an honor to be here tonight, surrounded by so many compassionate souls. When we look at the challenges facing the most vulnerable children in our community, it is our duty, our privilege, to step up and help." I watched her speak, the words washing over me. She was so good at this. She believed her own lies. Behind her, a massive screen showed the logo of the Children's Hospital. Arthur sent me a text. "Vincent is ready. On your signal." I watched Jessica's face. She was building to her big emotional point, the part where she would ask for donations. "Every dollar you give tonight," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "is a promise to a child that they are not forgotten. It is a promise of hope." That was the moment. I typed a single word to Arthur. Now, on the screen, Jessica's perfect, smiling face was suddenly replaced by a high-resolution image of my father's ledger, the neat columns of numbers, the names of shell corporations. A collective gasp went through the ballroom. You could hear it even through the laptop speakers. Jessica faltered. She looked behind her smile freezing on her face. She saw the page detailing a $2 million transfer to a Cayman Islands account, an account named after her own horse. Then the audio kicked in. It wasn't the sad piano music of a charity video. It was Ashley's voice, sharp and cold, echoing through the ballroom. "The FBI can look all they want. They'll never find it. We're smarter than Dad ever was." The room fell into a dead, shocked silence. Jessica stood at the podium, paralyzed. Her face had turned a sickly white. The screen switched to another page of the ledger, this one showing how they had funneled money from the charity's own endowment fund. The silence broke. A low murmur started, growing into a roar of conversation. People were standing up, pointing at the screen, pulling out their phones. Laura's camera zoomed in on Jessica's face, capturing her look of pure, unfiltered horror. Then it panned to find Ashley, who was trying to push her way toward an exit, her face a mask of panic. The live feed was chaos. Cameras were flashing everywhere. Jessica finally moved, grabbing her notes and stumbling away from the podium as if it were on fire. She tripped on her dress and fell to her knees. No one moved to help her. They just watched, their phones held up to record her humiliation. I closed the laptop. I didn't need to see anymore. The sound of distant sirens started to grow outside my own window. It wasn't from the newsfeed anymore. It was real. They were coming for them. The public execution was complete. The empire was not just paralyzed. It was dead, and I had been the one to pull the switch. The sound of the sirens grew louder, a piercing shriek that seemed to cut through the night and aim directly for me. For a moment, I thought they were for me, but then I looked back at the live feed on my laptop. Laura's camera work was incredible. She was steady, capturing the chaos with a professional calm. The blue and red lights washed over the panicked faces of the guests in the hotel ballroom. Police officers were entering, their movements calm and deliberate in the middle of the hysteria. I watched as 2 officers approached Jessica, who was still on the floor, a mess of expensive fabric and broken pride. They helped her up, their hands firm on her arms. She didn't resist. Her face was blank, her eyes empty. It was as if the person I knew, the cold, calculating sister, had simply left her body. Then I saw them put the handcuffs on her. The click was inaudible on the feed, but I felt it in my bones. A final metallic sound of a door slamming shut forever. Laura's camera panned across the room, finding Ashley near a service exit, being blocked by another pair of officers. Unlike Jessica, Ashley was fighting. She was yelling, her voice a shrill, ugly thing. She was saying something about her lawyers, about who she was, but the words had no power anymore. They were just noise. An officer took her arm and she tried to pull away. He was patient but firm. A moment later, her hands were cuffed behind her back too. The two most powerful women in the city, brought down in front of everyone they had ever tried to impress. The next few days were a blur of headlines. Arthur kept me updated, sending me links to news articles and clips from television reports. The company my father built, the empire Ashley and Jessica had stolen, collapsed overnight. The stock value went to zero. Partners pulled out of deals. Investors sued. Every news channel had their faces on a loop, transitioning from their glamorous society photos to the grainy footage of their arrest. The story was too perfect. Two beautiful, wealthy sisters, heads of a beloved charity, exposed as frauds and thieves. Their social world vanished even faster than their financial one. The country club membership was revoked. Invitations to future galas were rescinded. Friends stopped answering their calls. Their names became a punchline on late-night talk shows. They were no longer symbols of success. They were symbols of greed and disgrace. Everything they had built their identities on, money, status, and the approval of others, was gone. It had all been a house of cards, and my father's old briefcase had been the gust of wind that blew it all down. The trial was short. The evidence Arthur and I had compiled was overwhelming. My father's ledger, combined with the bank records Vincent had uncovered, painted a clear picture of years of systematic fraud. They had stolen from the company, from investors, and worst of all, from the very charity they claimed to champion. The jury was out for less than 3 hours. I was not in the courtroom when the verdict was read, but I watched it on the news. Guilty, on all counts. Ashley stared straight ahead, her face a stone mask. Jessica finally broke, sobbing quietly into her hands. The judge sentenced them to 15 years in a federal prison. 15 years. It was more than I had expected. It was justice, cold and absolute. 6 months later, I got a letter. It was from Jessica. She wanted to see me. I thought about ignoring it, about throwing it away and never looking back, but a part of me needed to see it through to the very end. The prison visiting room was a sterile, gray box that smelled of disinfectant. When Jessica walked in, I barely recognized her. She wore a plain gray uniform. Her hair was cut short with no expensive styling. Her face was pale and tired, stripped of all its makeup and arrogance. She looked smaller, older. She sat down across from me, separated by a thick pane of glass. We just looked at each other for a long time. "Why are you here?" I finally asked. My voice was flat, without anger. She looked down at her hands. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know it's too late. I know it doesn't change anything, but I am. We got so lost, so caught up in having more, in being more than him. We hated that he loved you more." I stayed silent. It wasn't an excuse, but it was the first honest thing she had said to me in 20 years. "The briefcase," she said, looking up at me, her eyes filled with a sad, tired curiosity. "Was it always his plan, for you to have that?" "I think it was his way of giving me a choice," I said. "A choice to walk away, or a choice to fight for what was right." She nodded slowly, a single tear rolling down her cheek. "He always did believe in you," she said. We didn't say much after that. When the guard told her time was up, she stood and gave me one last look. It wasn't a look of hatred or envy. It was a look of resignation, of an ending. I watched her walk away, a ghost in a gray uniform. I picked up the phone to leave, and as I did, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The revenge was over. It was complete. My father's true inheritance wasn't the money or the company. It was the truth. And now, for the first time in a very long time, I was free. From a dusty briefcase to their empire crumbled. My sisters got the money, but I got the truth and my father's legacy back. What did you think of my revenge? Subscribe for more intense stories like this.